I get to be up here again. I was up here last week talking about Matthew chapter 23. In that chapter, we have this very intense dialogue between, well, not really a dialogue, more of a monologue of Jesus condemning and chastising the Pharisees for their hypocrisy and their treatment of the people of God. And we kind of arrived at a concluding point that Matthew is bringing out this theme of the conflict of the seed. So in Genesis chapter 3, there's this promise of conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And Matthew, the author in chapter 23, brings that out and really lays that on the table that the Pharisees are this opposition to God. They are the seed of the serpent, and he is the seed of the woman, and they are contending with each other. There's conflict between these two. And at the summation of that, in chapter 23, Jesus makes a pronouncement. He finishes chastising them, and in chapter 23, verse 27, he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And so, chapter 23 kind of closes out this scene with the Pharisees. That starts in chapter 21, where Jesus enters the temple and, contends with or fights with the Pharisees. And then here at the end, he's now proclaiming that Jerusalem, your house is left to you desolate. Okay? Which is kind of an important thing as we're moving into the next chapter here, because chapter 24 starts with Jesus leaving the temple. Okay, so he enters the temple in chapter 21. He, at the end of 23, and proclaims the house of Jerusalem desolate. And then he leaves the temple. Okay, so there's this focus around here that that will kind of affect how we view this chapter. Now, on the outset of this, I do want to say that chapter 24 of Matthew is it's a very charged chapter. There's a lot of stuff that gets taken different ways because it's prophetic, and it's $5 word here. It's eschatological, which basically means that it's referring to, in some way, form, or fashion, the end times. Okay, and so whenever that happens, people, not for no reason, but people tend to make a lot of assumptions and take it a lot of different directions. Okay, so we're going to keep that in mind as we're reading through this chapter. Well, I think we'll start by, where do I have it here? Okay, how I'm going to present this chapter and what I think the main point of it is, or what we're going to take away, if you will, from this chapter, is that Matthew 24 comes at the end of this pronouncement of condemnation on the religious leaders of Israel at the time, and this promise, this statement of removal of the guardianship or the keys of the kingdom of God from them. If we remember the fig tree, that all happens there. There's this phrase that Jesus says, "May no fruit ever come from you again," and the fig tree withers. Well, chapter 23 ends with a lot of similarities between that and what he says regarding Jerusalem, that your house is left to you desolate. And so here, there's now a shift to where Jesus is done with the Pharisees, and now he's going to be speaking to his disciples privately. And that's going to continue on through 24 and into chapter 25. And this is the very last collection of Jesus' teachings in the book of Matthew, because the rest of it from chapter 26 on is the passion narrative of his trial, crucifixion, death, burial, resurrection. So this is the last collection of teachings that Jesus has, and it's done privately with his disciples. The Pharisees are no longer engaged with. He's done there. And what Jesus does is he gives a prophetic declaration of troubles with this pervasive call to remain loyal to Christ. Okay? So Jesus is going to be talking about things that will happen in the future. He's going to do that while simultaneously reminding his disciples to stay with him and to continue on faithful to him. Okay? So, giving that kind of framework here, chapter 24 starts with verse 1 and says, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Okay. So this statement here is prophetic on Jesus' part, right? And some people probably know what Jesus is referring to here, but more than likely he's referring to the destruction of the temple in the year AD 70. And if you've ever done any studying on end times or the different views on the end times, you probably are familiar with that date, AD 70, because in one view of the end times, it's a very important date. Because if you hold to what's called a preterist view of the end times, then you're going to hold to a position that most of the book of Revelation is a fulfillment, or was fulfilled in the year AD 70. Okay? That's not the view that I'm going to put forward in this chapter, but that is here in these couple of verses what Jesus is referring to. He's saying that this temple, this building that was the dwelling place of the glory of God, that was such a important part of Jewish culture and religion and their thoughts on what the kingdom of heaven was going to be like. Jesus is here saying this is all going to be rubbish very soon. And so that context here, the disciples hearing that, it's going to set off alarm bells in their head. It's a very important thing for them to comprehend, because in their minds, the Messiah was going to come into Jerusalem, establish the kingdom, overthrow the oppressors, and do away with sin by just removing the sinful. That's why John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world." Their thought was that the Messiah, was going to come in and just annihilate the sinful, and only Israel would remain in Jerusalem. And so the concept of the temple being destroyed was very important here. And so the disciples, in that context, in verse 3, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And so the disciples ask essentially a three-part question here. They ask him, when will these things be? Referring to probably the destruction of the temple. Then they ask him, what will be the sign, first of your coming, and then second, of the end of the age? It's kind of like a two-part, two things in one question there. Okay? So, the answer that Jesus gives is going to be pertaining to the three parts of the disciples' questions. Three parts of the disciples' questions. Now, I'm not going to present this chapter in probably a traditional way, okay? And what I mean by that is when I typically have heard people talk about or present chapter 24 of Matthew, it's done in this format. You read, hear of wars and rumors of wars, and then we say, now I've heard that in Syria there's conflict there, and then there's conflict over here, and so usually it's the format of a sign from the text, and then a current event that is tried to fit and match that sign, right? I'm not going to do that because I don't think that's appropriate for this chapter. And the reason is because I think that I might get in trouble saying this, but I think that there is way less than is typically thought of in this chapter that we can actually apply as signs of the end times. Okay? So we're going to read through verses 3 through 14 to start with, and then we're gonna talk about that a little bit. And since we're smaller in number, we can have more discussion. So while we're reading through these verses, I want you to think about some of the questions that I have, the two questions that I have on the slide there. Can we point to any of the things listed in these 10 or so verses that we can point to as being like, yeah, that's a sign of the end of the age to come? Or why would any of this be surprising to the disciples here? So reading through verses 3 to 14. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all the nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come." Okay. So reading through that, right? It sounds very apocalyptic. It sounds, very, biblical, let's say, right? The question that after reading through this, the question that I asked myself was, which of these things that Christ is talking about and mentioning would have been new to the world? I mean, nothing, right? So in these verses, do we read anything as we were reading that? Did any of them strike you as something that was, I guess, that was something that would be surprising, that we could maybe look to as, oh, this is happening, and that wasn't happening before. We're probably closer to the end times now than we were before. Do we see anything like that? No, right? Because since the fall, just throughout the biblical history, but since the fall of man, I mean, there's been famines, earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, enmity between nations, and conflict, right? So why I spent some time on the front end describing why the disciples were so drawn up in the temple is because Jesus is essentially saying that what you think the next age, let's say, how you think time is, what the world is going to look like beyond this is not going to be what you expected, okay? The temple is going to be destroyed, and the world is going to continue in this way beyond my presence here, okay? the one thing that might be a trigger to you is not a trigger, but might be a catch to you is verse 14, where it says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, then the end will come." Okay? Now, there's probably, think about it one of two ways. The way it's typically thought of, or maybe typically thought of, but the way I've heard it said a lot is that, no, the gospel has to be preached in every single corner of the world, and so we know that it hasn't happened yet because Jesus hasn't come back. So there must be somewhere in the world that the gospel hasn't been preached yet. And while that may be true, it probably is, there's a lot of unreached out there. To put that as a stipulation on when Christ will come back, when the tribulation will happen, or whatever. To put that as a stipulation on these things must take place before God decides to bring about the next part of His program. It makes it. I figured Rick would have something to say there. It makes it to a point where God is bound to be quantified and measured, and you can almost get to a point where you could potentially know the hour and the time, essentially. And we know that nobody can know that because only the Father knows. I think Rick had his hand up there, so we can get him a microphone. Oh, you got one? Oh, good man.
Your wife gave it to me when she's
Oh.
obviously
she is a helper suitable for me.
Obviously, with the internet and all that kind of things, that verse is already true. The gospel is preached to the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but the little phrase in verse 10, it's kind of important. I interested in your view on that. At that time, that's kind of a very specific statement. It's not just a general time, it's a specific time at that time. So how do you take that?
So I think what translation are you using? Because mine says, "and then." The right one, the New American Standard? Okay. So mine says, "and then many will fall away." So the phrase "at that time" could be referring to a very specific moment, right? Designated and referenced, or it could be a phrase that could be a reference to a period, right? So when I say, so let's see, Joan of Arc was a military leader in the medieval times, right? And at that time, Christianity was very, very different than it is now. And there's a lot of persecution. So the phrase "at that time" refers to the medieval period in that context, right? So I think that's probably what's going on there.
Allow me to respond?
Yeah.
Okay, so that is a relative pronoun.
Mm-hmm.
Pronouns always have antecedents, right?
Yeah.
So that refers back to something. So you have to deal with the context.
Mm-hmm.
So the context, goes back to, well, my glasses, seems to me, has got to go back to, this whole thing he's talking about in verse 3. When will these things be? And that would seem to be the most logical antecedent to that.
Can I counter?
No.
Okay. You ask, so I ask. But I would say that the closest possible antecedent to that would actually be verse 9, where it's referring to the tribulation that Jesus is saying the disciples will face, right? So in verse 9 it says, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all the nations for my name's sake. At that time, many will fall away." So during this time of tribulation that Jesus is predicting, when that happens, many are going to fall away from that.
Okay, so what does then refer to?
What is they?
Then.
Oh, then?
That goes back. It seems to me, that the context is really important. Okay,
Sure.
So
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that makes much difference in our discussion here, so I'll end my part of the debate.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good discussion, right? Because this is what a lot of people get hung up on, or not hung up on, but this is where a lot of the differing views arise from, right? Is how the language is broken down through here, right? But yet, I agree with you that the context of all this is there is a question by the disciples asking, when will these things be, right? And so that is the catalyst that starts the whole discourse, right? So all things are going to tie back to the answer as an answer to those questions. However, I think that the phrase "at that time" refers to the age at which Jesus is described, not a specific moment. That's how I would break it down in that specific instance. But the good thing about discussion is that there doesn't have to be uniformity in the thought, right? There can be multiple views and still have unity, right? I don't know, but I don't think so. But
You're not saying, I don't think anyone thinks you are, but you're not saying that these things, that Jesus isn't actually making prophetic statements. They are prophetic.
Yeah.
It's just that I think the tendency that people have is to look at these things and try to apply it to their current events
Right.
necessarily. When, to your question, why would the disciples find any of this surprising? Well, it's because, the expectation of the Messiah is that things aren't going to get worse.
right.
Things are going to get better.
Yeah, we touched on that because we said the Messiah was going to enter Jerusalem, overthrow the oppressors, remove sin, and dwell in Jerusalem forever. That was the thought. So a lot of this is surprising and prophetic. To us on this side of it, it's less so. But I think, so to your point though, Levi, a lot of people try to take current events and fit it into this text, and that's what's in the academia, that's called a historicist view of the end times. People will do that with the book of Revelation as well. They'll look at certain things in the book of Revelation and they'll say, oh, that fits what's happening right now over in Ukraine, right? They'll look at that kind of stuff and they'll apply it to current events, which I don't think is I don't think that's appropriate to what the text is doing here. So anyway, I skipped a slide. Or I skipped forward. Okay, so really I think what Jesus is describing here is essentially he's telling the disciples that, what it's going to look like is much the same of what has been going on prior to this. It's not going to be the ultimate removal of sin. There's still going to be conflict and war and troubles and persecutions after he's gone. Okay. Now, so I would say that Jesus is basically describing in these first few verses the church age, which we currently are in. Now, we get into verses 15 through 28, which is going to take, I think, the most of our time. And there's a couple of I left this slide kind of intentionally not filled out with bullet points because there's a couple of ways that we can go about it. When I was looking into this, I probably spent more time looking at the book of Daniel than I probably looked at the book of Matthew during these verses, okay? So we can go about it one way, which is I can give you kind of the summary of what I studied on Matthew or on Daniel and how it relates to this. Or I can present some questions and we can go back to the book of Daniel and work through it a little bit together. Do you want kind of like a choose your own adventure? Do you want number 1 or number 2? Yes to both? We're going to combine them and make 3. Okay. There's no strong opinions. I'm just going to keep talking, and you all can raise your hands when you have something to say, good or bad or not neutral. Don't say anything neutral. Okay. All right. So there seems to be a break or a shift or a change between verses 14 to 15. And so to lay it all out there on the front end, I think Jesus is talking about the church age until verse 14. After verse 15 and on, I believe that he is now talking more into the tribulation, the time that is after the church age. What happens after the church is raptured and in that 7-year period of the tribulation. Okay? So, verse 15 starts, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetops not go down to take what is in the house, and let not the one who is in the field turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such has not been seen, has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." We'll stop there for right now, because this phrase, the abomination of desolation, as spoken of by the prophet Daniel, sounds like it sounds like I should read that in the movie trailer voice. Daniel and the abomination of desolation, right? But this is a callback to an Old Testament prophet, Daniel, and I find it, after having read this, I find it hilarious that Matthew chose to put in after that, it says, "Let the reader understand," because Daniel is apparently one of the toughest books to understand. It doesn't fit into any category properly, because it's narrative for the first half, and then it's prophecy for the second half. But the prophecy in the second half also is very historically based, and the prophecy is apocalyptic, but also kind of not, and so it doesn't really fit well into any one category. And so the fact that Matthew here says, "Let the reader understand this," is just kind of tongue-in-cheek. You have to kind of dig into this a little bit, I think, to get at what the meaning is here. But we're going to do our best in the next couple of minutes here. So Daniel, in the second half of that book, sees lots of visions. And his visions are usually about kingdoms or kings and the conflict between them. And they're pictured in different ways. There's a ram and a goat, and they represent two kings, and their horns represent different kings that follow them, and all this stuff. It's very complicated to follow. Okay, and so the symbolism, the imagery there is tricky, but there are several references to this thing or this event called the abomination that leaves desolate, or the abomination of desolation. And in chapter 10, I think, now I'm going to get mixed up. No, sorry, chapter 8, there's this vision that Daniel has between of a goat and a ram, and they're in conflict with each other. And in verse 9 of chapter 8, it says, one of them, or out of one of them, one of the horns of the goat, out of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and will act and prosper. And then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary, and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." Okay, so there's a lot there, right? It's confusing just in those few verses, but what I want to focus in on there is that there's conflict, there's something that happens that the one who seems to be kind of wicked and the transgressor seems to prosper and grows strong, and something happens where the holy place, or where God dwells, there's something there. There's something that is idolatrous and something that leaves barren and empty that happens there. And the question arises, how long will this take place? And the answer is given 2,300 evenings and mornings. And that 2,300 adds up to right about 7 years. Okay, so it's safe-ish to assume that what's being referred to here is the tribulation period. So something about the 7-year period, there's some event that happens where the holy place is made barren and empty, and there's nothingness there. And it's done so in a way that there is idolatry and something that is wholly offensive to God that happens. Okay? So that's the first mention of it. And then in chapter 9, verse 27, it says, and he, the one who is a transgressor and wicked, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wings of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Okay? And then lastly, in chapter 12, and from there's another vision that happens, and this one is explicitly on the time of the end, as what's called in this chapter. It says, from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. And so, again, if there's this repeated refrain through Daniel of this something that happens where something idolatrous and something through that idolatry, the place of God is made barren and empty. Okay? That's what abomination that leaves desolate kind of implies. And so, in the book of Daniel, it seems to always be in reference to these days, these numbered days that seem to add up to about 7 years. Okay? And so, what I take from that is that the reference in the book of Matthew here is when Jesus pulls that from the book of Daniel, he's now addressing a time that is during the tribulation. Okay? And the context in Daniel is there's a desire from Daniel to see a final dealing with and a culmination of the overthrowing of sin, the complete resolution to the problem of man. Okay, so there's an overall context to that throughout the book. And so here, the prophecy or the visions that he has are tied into that, and they kind of bring out that into the book of Matthew here. So the question on the disciples' minds is, when will these things be? When will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? When is there going to be this final resolution? When is sin finally going to be done away with? When is there going to be closure? And when is the kingdom going to be established? And Jesus describes, I would argue, the church age, and says that there's still going to be conflict, sin, trouble there. Then he's describing the tribulation age, that 7-year period, And there's going to be even worse hardships and toils and persecutions there, to the point where it says in verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. So something about that time, it is, I'll put it this way. Our history, human history, is filled with atrocities and pretty bad stuff. I've been listening to an audiobook on an event in history called the Rape of Nanking, which was an event in the Japanese-Chinese Wars in 1937. And it's a tough book to listen to because of how wickedly humans acted one to another. So as bad as that was, and as horrible as that seems, whatever's going to happen in this time that Jesus is talking about here is going to be beyond that. It's going to be worse than that. And so on this side of the Bible being composed and everything, we know, okay, we have the book of Revelation, and the things that are described there kind of fit the model there in verses 15 through 23. So I would say that Jesus is describing the church age for the first 14 verses. Then he's describing the tribulation age during those verses 15 to 23. And so my question on that is, us here, right now, are we given, in any of these verses that we've read so far, are we given something that we can look at and say, yeah, that's what I see in the world around me. I know that we're close. I know it's just a few more years before Jesus comes back. Probably not, right? Because whatever this abomination, reading through it, really the only sign that seems to be given is this abomination of desolation. And that is vague enough to where I couldn't directly point to what that even means. And that seems to be tied to the tribulation, which is in a dispensational view, which I hold to. The church is going to be raptured by that point. So it's not even a sign that we would have to be concerned about. So that's where I think we're at this point in the chapter, is that, yes, Jesus is making prophetic statements, and yeah, to his disciples, there is definitely some shock there and some surprise. Being on this side of it, we can look at it and understand Jesus is kind of laying out the program on into the future, but we aren't appropriately going to find current events to draw out from chapter 24. Any thoughts on that so far? Levi was fidgeting with his microphone, so I thought there might be.
This is probably an area I'm pretty weak in study-wise, but I know some hold that, because there's been like murmurings about rebuilding the temple.
Yeah.
And where allegedly that's where the abomination of desolation would be. And so they'd have to resume the temple sacrifices. Well, they can't do that unless there's a temple.
Mm-hmm.
And so some might say, like, well, if they rebuild that temple, there you go. Like 1947, Israel's a nation again. Now we just got to get the temple. And then like once the temple's rebuilt, well, maybe I don't know. People have said that, it's interesting to me.
And I think that's appropriate, right? Because there's an appropriateness to that. I should say it that way. Because people who do that, they're trying to take a literal, or they are taking a literal interpretation of Scripture, which I do agree with. So I do find myself in that camp where the events of Revelation and here, they seem to point to there still being a sacrificial system in place, the temple being erected, and all that stuff. And I think I'm more in that camp than I'm not. However, the Greek there in verse 15, it can be holy place or it can be holy one. I think there's different. I might be wrong there, but there was a subtle nuance of the translation that it could be something different than just holy place. But I'm not trying to hard and fast say that this is exactly how it must be, I guess, if that makes sense. But I do agree with you. I do think that there will be a temple that is built and that there will be, the sacrifices will be restored in some way, form, or fashion. Well, so let's say that happens this year, okay? Yeah, right. It's like, hey, it's going to happen, guys. Well, that doesn't change my attitude. I still know what's going to happen, right? I still also have no idea when, right? They might reestablish the sacrifice and rebuild the temple in 2023, and Christ might not come back again until 3053, you know? So there's nothing in here for me personally that I can point to and say, I know for sure that it's going to happen within a certain time frame. But what I do know is that at the very beginning of this, all this discussion, the disciples asked him a question, and how Jesus starts his answer is fascinating. He starts his answer by saying, see that no one leads you astray. Okay? For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars and all that stuff. But he starts his answer with a caution not to be led astray by people who are claiming to be the Christ or the Messiah or the deliverer. They're claiming to be the one who will deal with sin and establish, finality to the problem of man. And then he gives all this stuff that he says that is prophetic, and then he ends it by saying in verse 23, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. And if they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So kind of a weird way of saying it, but so Jesus starts and ends this this part of the Olivet Discourse with a warning, or with warnings, not to be led astray by people claiming to be who Jesus is. So don't listen to people who are claiming to be Christ, right? And don't listen to those who claim to have found the Christ, right? And Jesus unabashedly, through a kind of a metaphor, he's saying that, these people are just feeding off of you, of the ones who are led astray. They're vultures gathered around a dead corpse. There's death there, and people are just going to feed off of that. These ones who lead people astray, they're just feeding off of them. And so we're doing good. My takeaway from chapter 24, the first 28 verses anyway, we're going to get into other stuff later on, like the coming of Christ. And there's this whole thing about the fig tree generation that's a whole fun thing to talk about because people have fun views of that. But how he starts the first section here is by reminding his disciples that, or telling his disciples that it's going to be different than you thought it was going to be. There's going to be much more difficulties ahead, but regardless of the time that we find ourselves in, and regardless of the circumstances or the atrocities or the persecutions that we face, there is and will only ever be one Messiah, one Jesus, one Christ, who has dealt with sin and will return to punish it fully. So that's the takeaway from this chapter that I got. And I think that, it doesn't sound, how shall I say it? It doesn't tickle the ears as maybe an end times message would, trying to find things in our world and our culture that we can look to get excited about Jesus coming back. And that's okay. Because I rest in the fact that he will return because he said he would. And he's demonstrated that he's demonstrated that he will do what he has said. And so this last teaching of Jesus is going to take us through chapter 25. We're going to hear about his passion narrative. And then at the end of the book, before he ascends, there's this great phrase that in verse 20, the very last verse of the book, teaching them, his disciples, to observe all, teaching them who the disciples go out and reach, to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Amen. That's right. So we have one more song to sing here, and I actually chose this song to kind of match this because we have one King, we have one Jesus who will reign forever, and we trust in him. So this song is called Only King Forever, right? And so as we sing this, just kind of keep that in mind and in your thoughts that there's only one, and there will ever only be one Jesus.